Hi, my name is Paul Goeringer. I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland, and I'm also a part of the University of Maryland's Empowers Ag Law Education Initiative. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when you have growing crops, the lease terminates, and you want to go back on the property and harvest those crops. This is a common situation that happens a lot in Maryland. I get quite a few phone calls, at least once or twice a month asking me this question. The answer to this question is going to be, was it addressed in the lease? If it wasn't addressed in the lease, what are some court-made views of how this issue should be settled? We're going to deal with if it isn't addressed in the lease first, because that's a little more complicated to deal with. Addressing it in the lease is fairly simple and straightforward to deal with. If it isn't addressed in the lease, we're going to have to look at two different views of this. The first view is, was the lease term for a certain period of time? A certain period of time would be, did the lease end on a specific date? So, for example, did the lease end on December 31st of whatever year? Did you know this? Was it written in the lease that way? If that's the case, then you don't have a right to the growing crops. This is because we don't want to extend the lease beyond the time period that you leased it for. You knew when it was going in, and you shouldn't have planted the crops. That has always been the court's views in these issues when we're dealing with a certain period of time. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. One exception is, did the landlord tell you you would be able to come back on the property and harvest the crops? If that's the case, then you may be able to go on and harvest them. Another exception would be, is it common practice in the area to allow people to come back on the property to harvest crops after the lease is terminated? If that's the case, then you're probably going to be allowed back on the property to harvest those crops. The other exception, not really exception, the other view of this is if the time period is uncertain. So what's an uncertain time period? An uncertain time period would be what we see on a lot of ag leases. So the lease says it's going to end on a specific date, but then it has language that says it ends whenever notice is given by one of the parties. So it may extend beyond that period of time. If it extends beyond that period of time till notice is given, then that's a case when we're dealing with an uncertain time period. And this is what's known as the doctrine of enablements. The doctrine of enablements requires this uncertain period of time. If it's the certain period of time, this doctrine does not apply. Other things that need to be there for this doctrine to apply are the fact that the termination was not due to the tenant, but was due to the landlord, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And then the other thing is that it probably needs to be an annual crop and not a perennial crop, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a second too. But looking back at the termination being the landlord's fault and not the tenant's fault, what does that mean? Well, it means the landlord gave the notice to terminate the lease, not the tenant, or the tenant isn't being evicted for not paying rent or doing something they should be doing under the lease. If any of that's the case, you're being evicted or you're not paying rent or you gave notice to terminate, this doctrine's not going to apply to your case. But if it's a case where the landlord's giving notice to terminate, then it's going to apply. The other thing to think about is it has to be an annual crop. So it has to be something like corn, wheat, soybeans, something like that that you plant each year and you harvest each year. It's not going to be able to be a perennial, which is grasses, hays, fruit trees, stuff like that that you're going to have to harvest over a period of time. Why? Because if it's for a long period of time that you're going to have to harvest this, you probably shouldn't have planted it during an uncertain period of time in the lease. You may have wanted to have it specifically set out in the lease how long it's going to last. And if we allowed it to happen, we could extend this lease longer than we probably should, and to the detriment of the landlord. So it's only really going to apply to annual crops. The other thing to address in this is if it does apply, or one of the exceptions with the certain period of time applies, how long do you have to harvest a crop? Well, you have a reasonable amount of time. So it means that you're going to have amount of time for the crop to grow and then come to harvest, and then you're going to have to go on and harvest it within a reasonable amount of time, which is going to depend on the weather, what the harvest is like, a lot of other factors that are going to go into it. The final thing we need to talk about is, well, what if the lease addresses this? If the lease addresses this, that's the simplest way to handle this situation. You've already stated in the lease that you're going to be able to come back on the farm for a reasonable period of time to harvest a crop. You've already settled this issue. You don't have to go back and rely on these court-made doctrines to be able to harvest your crop. As I tell people, this is the simplest way, and everyone should consider putting it in their lease just so they have the right to come back on the farmland to harvest a crop. You may never need it, but it's there in case you do. And then at the end of this video, you're going to see some links that will direct you to some materials we have up on our website that are also up on the University of Maryland Extension website to help you develop a lease that includes language like that you would need to be able to come back on the farm and harvest the growing crops. And at the end, you'll also see my contact info. So if you have any questions, feel free to call me, email me, and I'll be happy to get back with you and answer any questions you might have. And thank you for watching. The University of Maryland Empowering the State brings together two universities, the University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland Baltimore. The Ag Law Education Initiative is one of the programs under Empowering the State. It brings together the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, the College of Agricultural and Natural Resources at the University of Maryland College Park, and then the University of Maryland Eastern Shore School of Agricultural and Natural Sciences. The lease agreements are available at extension.umd.edu/grainmarketing/lease agreements.